Sergeant Holloway slammed her file down on the table and actually laughed right in her face. Administrative transfer. Right. That's what they call it when someone breaks down and can't hack it anymore. He said it loud enough for every recruit in the room to hear. Maya Walker didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She just looked at him with eyes that had seen things he couldn't imagine in his worst nightmares. And that stillness, that terrifying, practiced stillness was the first sign that something was very, very wrong with this picture. Before we go any further, if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this journey all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The bus rolled through the front gates of Fort Bragg at 0530 hours on a Tuesday morning in late October, and the cold hit everyone the same way, sudden and different and completely without mercy. 23 recruits poured out onto the pavement with their bags and their nerves and their ideas about what this was going to be like. And almost immediately, the reality of where they were began doing what Fort Bragg always did to new people. It started taking them apart. Some of them stumbled, getting off the bus. One young man, barely 20 years old, dropped his duffel bag and had to scramble to pick it up while a drill instructor, already standing at attention, watched him with the kind of expression that made it very clear this would not be forgotten. Two women near the back of the group started whispering to each other, the nervous kind of whispering that happens when people are trying to convince themselves they are not terrified. A heavy-set man named Torres stood at the edge of the group and looked around like he was trying to figure out which direction danger was going to come from first. Maya Walker stepped off the bus last. She didn't rush. She didn't scan the area the way frightened people scan areas. She stepped down, set her bag beside her foot, and stood still. Not rigid, not performative. Just still the way a person is still when they have already run the numbers on every possible outcome and decided that panic is not one of the options. She was 28 years old with dark eyes and the kind of face that gave nothing away for free. Average height, nothing about her screamed attention, which was, if you understood anything about her at all, entirely the point. Sergeant Dale Holloway was the first one to get close to her. He was built like a man who had spent 30 years making other people uncomfortable on purpose. And he walked down the line of new recruits the way a storm front moves inevitable, loud and carrying the sense that things were about to get worse before they got better. He stopped in front of Maya. He looked at her file on the clipboard in his hand. He looked at her face. He looked back at the file. Walker, he said. Yes, Sergeant, she said. Administrative transfer. He said the words like they tasted strange. From where exactly? Personnel reassignment, Sergeant. Standard processing. Holloway's jaw tightened. I didn't ask what it was. I asked where from. There was a pause. Not a hesitation. Maya Walker did not hesitate. It was a pause the way a chess player pauses before a move they've already decided on. Fort Campbell, Sergeant. He stared at her for another 3 seconds. Then he moved on down the line and Maya went back to being still, and nobody around her noticed that Holloway had glanced back at her twice before he reached the end of the group. Torres noticed, though. He was standing close enough to have heard the whole exchange, and something about it lodged in his brain the way small, strange things do when you can't quite identify why they bother you. He glanced sideways at Maya. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking straight ahead. Jaw level, shoulders relaxed, and Torres thought nobody relaxes on their first day at Fort Bragg. Nobody who actually belongs here for the first time. But then Holloway was screaming at someone who had placed their bag down incorrectly, and Torres stopped thinking about Maya Walker for a while. The first 3 hours were what they always were, controlled chaos designed to establish hierarchy and break down every comfortable assumption a person walked through the gate carrying. They were processed, assigned, issued gear, screamed at, made to stand in lines that served no apparent purpose, and introduced to their barracks in a way that made it very clear the barracks were not a gift. They were a test. Everything here was a test, and most of the people taking it didn't even know the questions yet. The barracks were a long, narrow building with rows of bunks and footlockers, and the 23 recruits were given exactly 11 minutes to stow their personal gear and present themselves in formation outside. 11 minutes sounds reasonable until you are actually standing in the barracks trying to do it, and then it becomes immediately obvious that 11 minutes is not enough and was never supposed to be enough. That was the point. People threw things into their lockers. People knocked into each other. A young recruit named Davis, 19 years old and fresh out of high school from somewhere in Georgia, accidentally knocked someone else's gear off a bunk, and spent 45 seconds apologizing before someone told him to just move. The noise was considerable. The stress in the room was a physical thing you could almost touch. Maya Walker stood at her bunk at the far end of the row and placed her items into her locker with the quiet, deliberate efficiency of someone who had done this particular activity or something very much like it more times than she could count. Everything had a specific location. Everything went there precisely. She did not rush, and yet she finished in under 4 minutes. Then she sat on the edge of her bunk and waited. The woman in the bunk next to her was named Lisa Chen, 24 years old, a college graduate who had volunteered for this and was currently regretting several of her life choices. She glanced over at Maya with the look of someone who has just watched something they don't entirely understand. "How did you do that so fast?" Chen asked. "Practice," Maya said. "You've done basic training before." A very small pause. "I've moved a lot." Chen seemed to accept this because she was out of time to analyze it, and she turned back to her own locker, and Maya went back to waiting, and nobody understood yet that the stillness in that woman was not peace. It was weight. It was the specific, dense, load-bearing stillness of someone carrying something so heavy for so long that they had learned to make it invisible. Formation outside was brutal in the October cold. Holloway walked the line and found 11 separate things to be loudly unhappy about, and each one of those things belonged to someone who was not Maya Walker. She stood in her place with her chin level and her eyes forward and breathed slow, even breaths, and even standing completely still in a line of 23 people. There was something about the way she occupied space that was different. You couldn't point to it exactly. You just felt it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Recruit Torres felt it again. He was standing 2 people down from her, and he kept glancing over in spite of himself. There was a moment during Holloway's circuit of the formation when a truck backfired somewhere across the base, a loud, sharp bang that cracked through the morning air like a gunshot, and every single person in that formation flinched or jumped or pulled back in some instinctive way. Every person except Maya Walker. She didn't even blink. Her eyes tracked automatically to the source of the sound, a clean, practiced rotation of her head, assess, identify, dismiss, and then return to the front. It took less than a second, but Torres saw it, and he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, and he didn't fully understand why, but the feeling stayed with him. The morning moved through its paces with the relentless, grinding momentum that only military training has. There were physical assessments, there were briefings, there were more lines and more shouted instructions, and the beginning stages of what would eventually become routine, but in those first hours felt like standing inside a machine you didn't know how to operate. People made mistakes. People were corrected loudly. People started figuring out who they were going to align themselves with and who they were going to avoid, the way groups always do when they find themselves in a new and stressful environment together. Maya did not align herself with anyone. She completed every required task with clean, efficient precision, said exactly what needed to be said, and nothing more, and moved through the day like someone who was trying not to leave footprints. The first real crack appeared during the afternoon orientation run. 3 miles, not long, not by the standards of what this training was going to eventually require. But for a first day with the cold and the gear and the unfamiliar terrain and the fact that most of these people had been traveling and stressed and not sleeping well 3 miles was enough to start showing you who people actually were. Their pace setter dropped back after the first mile. 2 other recruits started struggling visibly by 1.5 miles. By mile 2, the group had fragmented into clusters, and Corporal Davis, the young Georgia kid, had gone quiet and pale in a way that suggested he was closer to his limit than he wanted to admit. Maya was running in the middle of the pack, which is to say she was holding herself in the middle of the pack. Because every 20 or 30 seconds, without appearing to do anything at all, she made a small adjustment, slowed half a step, moved to a slightly different position. The kind of micro adjustments that an experienced runner makes when they are managing their output with precision, when they know exactly where their ceiling is, and they are deliberately staying well below it. Torres was struggling. His breathing was rough and his form was falling apart, and he was grimly committed to not being the person who fell out when Maya moved up beside him without a word and matched his pace. She didn't say anything. She just ran. But her breathing was steady and controlled in a way that his wasn't, and somehow impossibly he found himself matching it. His own breathing started to even out. His stride lengthened a little. He finished the run. He looked for her afterward, wanting to say something, but she had already moved away and was standing alone, breathing almost normally, barely sweating, like she had done something mildly interesting rather than completed the same physical challenge that had left everyone else bent over their knees. That night, after lights out, the barracks were not entirely quiet. People whispered. People shifted in their bunks. Davis cried silently in the dark, the kind of crying you do when you're 19 years old, and you've just had the very long first day of a very hard choice, and you're trying not to let anyone hear you. Chen lay on her back, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the life she had left behind to be here. Torres fell asleep almost instantly, the exhaustion taking him before he could even finish the thought he was having. Maya lay in her bunk and did not sleep. She lay very still on her back, eyes open in the dark, and she breathed the slow and deliberate breathing of someone who had learned long ago that sleep was not always available and that the body could be managed through its refusals if you knew how to hold yourself. She stared at the ceiling of the barracks, and she listened to the sounds of the base at night, and her mind moved through things she kept locked behind a very specific door during the daylight hours. She had not wanted to come here. That was the first thing. She had not wanted to come to Fort Bragg, had not wanted to walk through another gate and put on another uniform and stand in another formation with people who didn't know her. She had done this because the alternative, the continuing alternative, the empty apartment, and the nights that were too long, and the days that had no structure to hold her upright was worse. She had tried the alternative, and it had been losing. So she had made a call and filled out the forms, and here she was, again, in a barracks, in the dark, pretending to be something smaller than what she was. Her locker was against the wall at the foot of her bunk. She did not look at it. She knew exactly what was in it, knew where everything was positioned, and there was one thing in there that she had not fully considered when she'd packed it, and now couldn't quite stop thinking about. She had folded it carefully, put it in a dark zippered bag, put the bag underneath everything else. It was fine. Nobody was going to go through her locker. There was no reason for anyone to find it. She made herself stop thinking about it. She closed her eyes and she ran through the layout of the base the way she'd mapped it that afternoon: exits, sightlines, choke points, high ground. Not because she needed to, not because there was any threat here, but because her brain did it automatically. Had been doing it automatically for years. She couldn't turn it off. She had tried to turn it off. The best she'd managed was learning to let it run quietly in the background without letting it swallow her whole. She was still awake at 0200 hours when she heard Davis make a sound in his bung that was not crying this time, but something closer to a nightmare. A sharp, short sound that cut off immediately, the sound of someone waking themselves up before the dream finished. She heard him sit up, heard the quiet, shaky breath he took, heard him lie back down. She knew that sound. She made that sound. She closed her eyes again, and she held the quiet close, and she did not sleep. The second day started at 4:45 with Holloway's voice cracking through the dark like something deliberately designed to cause suffering, which it was, and 23 people climbed out of their bunks with varying degrees of speed and coordination and began the process of becoming functional human beings under extreme time pressure. Maya was already sitting up when the lights came on. She was already dressed in 90 seconds, and she stood at the foot of her bunk, waiting while the rest of the barracks scrambled around her, and Chen saw her and thought again about how fast she'd moved the day before, and then Chen stopped thinking about it because she couldn't find her left boot. The second day was harder than the first day in the specific way that second days always are. The novelty was gone, the body was already registering its complaints, and the machine of training had picked up its pace now that the initial processing was done. There were drills, there were classroom sessions on protocols and regulations that were delivered with the specific aggressive dullness of instructors who had given these presentations too many times. There was a team obstacle course in the afternoon that was designed to see how people work together under pressure. That was where things started getting complicated. The obstacle course had a section that required the group to navigate a simulated building clearance, moving through a series of connected structures, relaying information, keeping people positioned correctly, maintaining communication when visibility was limited. It was meant to be chaos. It was meant to be overwhelming. Most recruit groups at this stage fumbled through it, slowly got turned around, lost people, failed to communicate, and eventually stumbled out the other side having learned several important things about what they didn't know yet. The group got turned around almost immediately. 3 people went the wrong direction at the first junction. Someone in the back couldn't hear the relay, and the communication chain broke. Davis stopped moving, entirely frozen at a decision point, with 2 equally unfamiliar paths in front of him, and the group was beginning to do what overwhelmed groups do, which was fracture and slow down. Maya was in the middle of the structure when she realized what was happening. She could feel it the way you feel a current changing direction in water. She heard the communication break down. She saw the hesitation spreading forward through the group like a virus. She did not make a speech. She did not announce anything. She moved to the junction where the group had split, planted herself where everyone could see her, and started talking. Not loud, not dramatic, but with an absolute and total certainty that stopped people in place. Left path leads to a dead end based on the layout of this building. Everyone on the left back to me now, single file. You 3, she pointed at specific people. You're covering the rear. Chen, you're going to be my eyes forward. Davis, you're between Chen and me. Move. It was over in about 30 seconds. The group reformed. They moved. They cleared the structure in under 4 minutes, which their observer noted quietly on his clipboard, said nothing about, and filed away. Holloway watched the replay footage that evening in the instructor's room, and he didn't say a word for a long time after it ended. Then he said, "Who is she?" Nobody in the room had a good answer. 3 days in, and the pattern was starting to set itself, Maya continued to move through training with the careful, calibrated precision of someone managing a very specific deception. And she was good at it. She had been good at many things in her life that required her to hold herself at a particular angle to the world. But there were edges showing, small things. The way she automatically scanned every room she walked into. The way she positioned herself in formation so she had sight lines in multiple directions. The way she reacted to sudden sounds, not with the flinch of someone surprised, but with the fast, smooth track of someone whose threat assessment system was permanently active. On the 4th day during a classroom session on land navigation, the instructor, a young corporal named Reyes, who was about 26 and doing his best, was walking the group through basic map reading when he put a topographic map on the board and asked if anyone could identify the primary features of the terrain shown. The room was quiet, map reading was new for most of them, and nobody wanted to be wrong in front of everyone else. Maya raised her hand. Reyes pointed at her, clearly expecting a partial answer, a guess, a starting point that he could then build on. What she did instead was walk him through every significant feature of that map: elevation, drainage avenues of approach, dead ground, natural choke points with the fluent, specific vocabulary of someone who had used tactical terrain analysis in conditions where being wrong about it had real consequences. She did it in 2 minutes. Reyes stood very still while she talked, and when she finished, he looked at her for a long moment and then said, "That's correct," in the voice of someone recalibrating something important. That night, Torres sat next to her at dinner for the first time. "Where'd you learn all that?" he asked. She looked at him, measured something. "I read," she said. Torres laughed genuinely, not sarcastically. "Nobody reads their way into knowing tactical terrain analysis like that." "I read a lot," she said, and picked up her fork, and Torres understood that the conversation was over. But he kept thinking about it. He kept thinking about all of it, the way she moved, the way she sounded in that building on the obstacle course, the way she'd read that map. He was 32 years old, and he'd had 2 tours of his own before coming back to training in a different capacity, and he knew the texture of what she was doing. He knew what it looked like when someone was very deliberately showing less than they had. He just didn't know why. On the 5th day during a physical training session in the gym, Maya was doing pull-ups with the clean, unhurried form of someone for whom pull-ups have long since stopped being interesting as a physical challenge. She was at 15 when Holloway walked up behind her and stood there. She finished at 20, dropped down, and turned to find him watching her. "Walk with me, Walker," he said. They moved to the far side of the gym away from the group. "Where did you say you were before Fort Campbell?" he asked. "I didn't say," she said. "No, you didn't." He looked at her steadily. "Your file is thin." "I was told it would be." Something shifted in his expression. "You were told. By who?" "Personnel." She held his gaze with complete steadiness. "Is there something specific you need from me, Sergeant?" Holloway's jaw worked for a moment. He looked like a man who was very good at identifying when something didn't add up, and who was currently standing next to something that didn't add up in a way that was starting to bother him on a professional level. You're going to stand out, he said finally. People are going to notice. I understand that, she said. I'm managing it. He stared at her. You're managing it, he repeated like the words didn't entirely make sense in that order. Yes, Sergeant. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he said, dismissed, and walked away. And Maya went back to the pull-up bar, and she did 5 more with the same clean, unhurried form, and she did not let herself think about what she'd just seen in his eyes, which was the specific look of a man who was not going to let this go. That evening, something happened that she hadn't planned for. The barracks were loud. The group had started to settle into itself in the way groups do. After a few days, the initial strangeness wearing down into something approaching community, and there was conversation and some laughter, and the beginning of the social architecture that forms wherever people are forced to live in close quarters under pressure. Maya sat on her bunk with a book she wasn't really reading, and for the most part, people left her alone because she gave off the very specific energy of someone who finds company optional. Chen was sitting on her own bunk, going through her locker, reorganizing things, when she knocked something over the bottom shelf of the open locker, catching on something, and the whole shelf tilted, and several items fell out onto the floor. She made a frustrated sound and climbed down to collect them, and as she did, she glanced down the row, and her eyes caught Maya's locker, which Maya had not fully closed, and she saw for just a moment. For barely 3 seconds before Maya's hand came out and pulled the locker shut, she saw the dark fabric of a uniform bag that had shifted to the side, and under the edge of it, the glint of metal. Not one piece of metal, several. The specific glint of service metals. Chen blinked. She looked away. She went back to reorganizing her own shelf. But her hands slowed down and her mind was doing something else entirely. And later that night, when the lights were out, she lay in her bunk and thought about what she'd seen. And she thought about the map and the obstacle course and the way Maya moved, and she thought that woman is not what she says she is. She didn't say anything. Not yet. But she was thinking about it. And thinking had a way of becoming talking, which was exactly the kind of thing Maya Walker had come to Fort Bragg trying to avoid. The truth about medals is that they are not what people think they are. Civilians think medals mean heroism. They think medals mean success, missions, accomplished enemies, defeated objectives taken. And sometimes that's part of it. But the people who wear them know what they really are. Their receipts, their documentation. Here is what it cost. Here is what you survived. Here is what happened to the people who didn't. Maya had not looked at those medals in 3 months. She knew they were there. She had put them in the bag and put the bag in the locker, and she had not looked at them because looking at them was the same as opening a door into a room she didn't have the capacity to walk into right now, and maybe not ever again. They were not pride. They were not accomplishment. They were weight disguised as metal, and she carried them because leaving them behind felt like a different kind of betrayal, and she was already full up on the kind she couldn't undo. She had received the Silver Star in a ceremony she had stood through, feeling like she was watching it happen to someone else. A general had pinned it to her chest and said things about valor and sacrifice, and she had said, "Yes, sir," and "Thank you, sir," and she had driven back to the barracks and sat on the edge of her bunk in the dark for a very long time before she could do anything else. She had received the Purple Heart in a hospital where Sarah's bed had been empty for 11 days. She closed her eyes in the dark of the Fort Bragg barracks, and she breathed, and she held the door to that room shut with everything she had. And eventually the night passed the way nights always do, not because they become easier, but because they end. The 6th day brought Colonel James Carter into the picture. He was not a dramatic entrance. He was not the kind of man who made dramatic entrances. He walked onto the training field during a morning drill assessment, and he stood at the edge of it with his hands clasped behind his back. And he watched, and the recruits who noticed him and recognized the rank on his collar all did small adjustments to their performance that they probably didn't consciously decide to make. Maya noticed him the moment he appeared on the field. She knew immediately that he was not there for the group. She knew it the way you know when a predator has entered the periphery of where you're standing, not from any single signal, but from the aggregate of signals that experienced instincts process faster than conscious thought. He was watching the group, yes, but twice in the first 10 minutes, she felt his attention focus on her with the specific weight of directed scrutiny. She did not change what she was doing. She performed exactly as well as she had allowed herself to perform every day since she arrived, which was well enough to pass without issues and not well enough to draw the kind of attention she was trying to avoid. She held herself inside the parameters she had set. But Colonel Carter was very old at this. He had spent 31 years learning how to look at people, and what he saw when he looked at Maya Walker was a woman who was performing her performance. And that was a very specific and very interesting thing to see. He left the field after 45 minutes. He walked back toward the main building with his hands still clasped behind his back, and before he went through the door, he stopped and looked back at the field for one more moment. At Maya. She was facing the other direction. She shouldn't have known he was looking. But her chin lifted by exactly 2 degrees, and he saw it, and he went inside, and he picked up the phone, and he made a call about an administrative transfer from Fort Campbell with an unusually thin personnel file. And something was beginning to move. Quietly, inevitably, the way a tide moves, you don't see it changing, and then you look down and you're standing in water. Maya felt it that evening. She couldn't have said exactly what changed, but something had shifted in the texture of how the day was ending, and she sat on her bunk with her book, and she held herself very still inside, and she thought how much longer. Not how much longer until training was over. Not how much longer until she could leave. How much longer until someone looked at her and saw what she actually was, and she had to stop pretending that she was just another person who had come to Fort Bragg to begin something, instead of what she really was, a woman who had come here to end something, to bury something, to find a place quiet enough and structured enough and demanding enough that the thing she was running from couldn't find enough oxygen to breathe. She had made it 6 days. In the bunk next to her, Chen was quiet and thoughtful in a way that had an edge to it, and Torres across the aisle kept glancing at her in the way people glance at something they're trying to figure out. And in an office in the main building, Colonel Carter was reading a set of search results on his computer screen with an expression on his face that was very still and very serious. And in her locker at the bottom, under everything else, the metal sat in the dark and waited. The 7th day at Fort Bragg began the same way the previous 6 had, with Holloway's voice, in the dark, in the cold, and the grinding machinery of training that didn't care how tired you were, or how little you'd slept, or what you were carrying inside of you that had nothing to do with the gear on your back. Maya was already awake when the lights came on. She was always already awake. Sleep had become something that happened to other people, something she observed from a distance, the way you observe weather through a window, when you're not sure it's safe to go outside. She moved through the morning routine with the same calibrated efficiency she'd maintained all week, and she told herself what she told herself every morning, which was one more day. Just get through one more day. Keep your head down. Keep your performance inside the lines. Don't let them see you. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known yet, was that Colonel James Carter had been on the phone until past midnight, and the conversation he'd had was going to change everything about how the next 24 hours went. Torres caught up with her at breakfast. He put his tray down across from her without asking which was new. He'd been working up to this. She could tell the way you can tell when someone has been rehearsing something they want to say. She looked at him and waited. "I'm not trying to get in your business," he said. "But," she said, "but I've been watching you all week, and I can't figure you out, and it's starting to bother me." She picked up her coffee cup. "I'm not that complicated." "See, that's the thing," Torres said, leaning forward slightly. "Complicated people never say they're not complicated. The ones who actually aren't complicated don't feel the need to say it." She looked at him for a long moment. There was something in his face that she recognized, not suspicion, exactly, not hostility. Something older than that. The look of someone who had been in enough places that they could recognize the shape of a person who'd been in places too. "You've deployed," she said. It wasn't a question. He nodded. 2 tours. Iraq. Came back, did a few years now here. She sipped her coffee. "I moved a lot," she said, and the corner of his mouth pulled sideways in something that was almost a smile, because they'd done this conversation before and they both knew where it ended. "Right," he said. He picked up his fork. He looked at her. "You don't have to tell me anything, but I want you to know whatever it is you're managing, you don't have to manage it completely alone." She didn't answer him right away. She turned her coffee cup in a slow circle on the tray, a small automatic gesture that was the closest thing to nervousness she ever showed. Then she said, "I appreciate that," and she meant it, and she also meant the thing underneath it, which was, "I cannot afford to take you up on it." Torres understood enough to let it go. They ate in silence that was surprisingly comfortable. And then they went back to training, and Maya thought about what he'd said for the rest of the morning in the small sealed room in the back of her mind, where she kept things she wasn't ready to look at directly. The morning session was weapons familiarization, standard issue, nothing unusual, the kind of drill that was designed to get recruits comfortable with handling weapons safely in a controlled environment. For most of them, it was new enough to be stressful, and the stress was visible in the careful, over-deliberate way people handled the weapons, the slight tremor in some hands, the overcorrected grips. Maya handled her weapon the way she handled everything else, with clean automatic precision that came from a place somewhere below conscious thought. The armorer who was running the session was a veteran staff sergeant named Kowalski, and he'd been doing this long enough that he knew within about 30 seconds of watching someone handle a weapon where they'd been in their life. He walked down the line, he watched. He got to Maya, and he stopped. He watched her for a full 20 seconds without saying anything. She completed the field strip and reassembly without looking at her hands. Kowalski said quietly enough that only she could hear him, "How many times you done that?" She locked the reassembled weapon. "Enough times," she said. "How many is enough times?" She looked at him directly. Something passed between them, the specific wordless recognition of people who understand the same things. He gave a small nod. He moved on down the line. He didn't say anything else to her, but twice during the rest of the session, she felt him looking at her, and his expression each time was the expression of someone doing arithmetic in their head that they're not entirely sure they want to finish. By midday, the base had that particular quality of controlled tension that happens when something has shifted in the administrative layers and the people at the bottom don't know it yet, but they can feel it anyway. The way animals feel pressure before a storm. Maya felt it. She didn't know what it was yet, but she filed it away in the part of her brain that tracked changes in environment, and she maintained her pace and her performance and her carefully managed invisibility. And she told herself, "You're fine. You're still fine." She was not entirely fine. In the afternoon, there was a team leadership exercise, a rotating scenario where each recruit had to take point on a simulated tactical decision. The structure was designed to see how people performed under the specific pressure of having to make a call while other people watched and waited for you to know what to do. Most people performed okay. Some performed well. Several performed exactly as badly as they had privately feared they would, which was a kind of awful useful information to have early in training. When it was Maya's turn, she stepped into the designated position and heard the scenario readout. Simulated casualty situation, 2 routes, 1 compromised unknown timeline, and she assessed it in approximately 4 seconds and gave a decision with a level of contextual detail and tactical reasoning that made the room very quiet. The instructor teaching scenarios, a lieutenant named Ferris, stopped typing his notes. He looked up at her. He looked back at his notes. He said, "That's correct. How did you get to that assessment?" "The compromised route has 3 signs of recent traffic inconsistent with the training schedule," she said. "The casualty timeline gives us 6 minutes before treatment becomes critical. The clean route adds 2 minutes but eliminates the variable. You don't take the variable when time is already constrained." Ferris stared at her. He said, "Where did you learn to read those signs?" And Maya realized a half-second too late that she had just answered with detail she shouldn't have had. She could see the moment she'd miscalculated, could feel it land like a step that found no floor. She said, "I read, like I said," but Ferris was already writing something down, and it wasn't the scenario result. That was the first real crack, not the weapons handling or the map reading or the navigation on the obstacle course. Those could all be explained individually as talent or study or natural aptitude. But the combination added up, assessed as a pattern, by someone who had been trained to look for patterns. The combination was starting to become something that didn't have an innocent explanation. Chen saw her face when she came back to her position after the scenario. Maya had it controlled in less than 3 seconds. The composure came down like a shutter over whatever had briefly crossed her features. But Chen had been watching, and 3 seconds was enough. "You okay?" Chen said low. "Fine," Maya said. "You don't look fine." "I am," Maya said, and her voice had the flat certainty of someone closing a topic, and Chen pressed her lips together and let it go but didn't stop watching. Didn't. The afternoon ended. The early dark of October came down over Fort Bragg, and the group moved through the end-of-day routine, and Maya moved with them. And she was thinking the whole time about Ferris's notes and what he was going to do with them. And she was thinking about whether she had time to do something about it. And she was thinking about Sarah the way she always started thinking about Sarah when things started going wrong. Because Sarah had been her warning system and her anchor and the person who would have known exactly what to do and said it in the direct, steady way she had said everything. And she was gone and Maya was here alone, doing this wrong. And that was the truth. She kept walking around the edges of the thing she couldn't look at straight. Dinner. Evening. The barracks settling into its nightly noise and then its nightly quiet. Maya sat on her bunk and held her book and read the same paragraph 4 times without retaining a single word. Chen sat down on the edge of her own bunk and looked at her. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask," Maya said. "What did you see in that scenario that nobody else saw?" Maya lowered the book. She looked at Chen, who had a calm, intelligent face and the kind of honest directness that was either going to be very useful or very dangerous. "What makes you think I saw something nobody else saw?" "Because Ferris stopped writing," Chen said, "and he's been writing the whole time for everyone without stopping. You made him stop. That means you said something he didn't expect." Maya was quiet for a moment. She was making a calculation. The wrong calculation in either direction carried consequences, and the space between them was narrow. "I pay attention," she said finally, "more than most people. That's all." Chen looked at her steadily. "That's not all, but okay." She paused. "For what it's worth, I'm not going to say anything to anyone. I just want you to know that I see you, whatever that's worth." And that small, simple thing was what almost undid her. Not Ferris's notes, not Holloway's scrutiny, not Carter's phone calls, or Kowalski's quiet assessment, or Torres's careful offers of something like solidarity. It was Chen saying, "I see you," in that plain, uncomplicated way, and the fact that it was the most terrifying thing anyone had said to her in months. Because being seen was the thing she had come here specifically to prevent. And it turned out that even here, even in a place designed to grind a person down to their functional components, you could not entirely disappear. People saw you anyway. People were built to see each other even when you were doing everything in your power to make them look somewhere else. She said, "Thank you." And she meant it the way you mean something when it hits a place inside you that you'd forgotten was still there. She did not sleep again that night. At 06:30 the following morning, Maya was informed that Colonel Carter wanted to see her. The message came through Holloway, who delivered it with an expression that gave nothing away except the fact that something was being given away. He found her at the end of the morning formation after dismissal, and he said, "Walker, Colonel Carter, main building conference room 20800. She looked at him. "What's the nature of the meeting?" "He didn't share that with me," Holloway said, and his voice had a quality to it that told her he was being precise about this specifically because he did know and had been told not to say. She nodded once. "Thank you, Sergeant." She had 90 minutes. She used 40 of them doing exactly what she would have done. Anyway, physical training, the morning run, the rotation of exercises she'd maintained since she arrived. She used the other 50, standing very still inside herself, and deciding what she was going to say and what she was not going to say, and how she was going to hold the line that was absolutely critically necessary to hold. Colonel Carter was already in the conference room when she got there. He was sitting at the table with a closed folder in front of him and a cup of coffee at his right hand, and he had the quality of a man who had arrived early on purpose, not to establish dominance, but because early arrival was simply what he did. He looked at her when she came in. He gestured to the chair across from him. She sat. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. This was, she understood, intentional. He was reading her the way she read rooms, and she let him, because she'd already decided that performing calm was less effective with someone like him than actually being calm, and she could actually be calm. She had a lot of practice. "Maya Walker," he said finally. "Yes, sir." "Administrative transfer. Fort Campbell." He said it in the same flat tone Holloway had used on the first day, which meant they'd talked, which she'd already assumed. "Can you tell me what your function was at Fort Campbell?" "Personnel reassignment, sir. Administrative support." He nodded slowly. He did not open the folder. He looked at her. "How long have you been doing administrative support?" "My file reflects my service record, sir." "Your file," he said, "is the thinnest file I have seen in 31 years, and I have seen a lot of files." He picked up his coffee cup. "Do you understand what a file that thin tells a man with my experience?" She held very still. Sir, it tells me that someone worked very hard to make it thin. He set down his cup. Files don't become thin by accident. They become thin when someone with authority decides they should be thin. And someone with that kind of authority doesn't make someone's file thin unless there's a reason. He looked at her. So I want to know the reason. The room was very quiet. She could hear the bass outside, the distant machinery of military life operating as it always did, indifferent and continuous. She had thought about this moment. She had rehearsed several versions of how it might go. None of the versions she'd rehearsed felt useful right now because Carter wasn't asking the questions she'd prepared for. He was asking the question underneath the questions, which was the harder one. Sir, she said, I was reassigned to this training cycle as part of a program I'm not in a position to detail. My file reflects what it's authorized to reflect. He watched her. Are you in danger? She blinked. That was not a question she had anticipated. No, sir. Is this program, whatever it is, sanctioned? Yes, sir. Yeah. By who? A pause. Of my pay grade, sir, and yours. He was quiet for a moment. Then something in his expression shifted, not softening exactly, but recalibrating. Are you here because you chose to be here? That one landed differently. She felt it land. She kept her face still and she said, yes, sir. Why? The question was direct and completely without decoration. She looked at him. She made a decision in the space of 2 seconds that she had been building toward for the past 8 days, maybe longer. Because I needed somewhere to be, she said. That's the most honest answer I have. He studied her face for a long time. He had a face that had been doing this kind of reading for 31 years, and she knew he was getting more from what she said than the words themselves. She let him get it. She was tired of the energy it took to prevent people from seeing things. He said, the leadership exercise yesterday, the weapons handling, the obstacle course on day 2, my people have been reporting to me all week. She said nothing. You're not what your file says, he said. It was not a question. No, sir, she said. I'm not. The air in the room changed. Something settled and something else opened up, the specific shift that happens when a long, maintained pretense gets set down between two people and they both look at it for a moment before deciding what to do next. Carter leaned back in his chair. He looked at her with an expression that had moved past assessment into something closer to respect, or the beginning of respect. I'm going to continue pulling on this thread, he said. I want you to know that. I'm not going to stop because you told me it's above my pay grade, because nothing on this base is above my pay grade. I understand, sir. But I'm also not going to blow up whatever it is you're doing here. He paused. Not yet. Not until I know more. He looked at her steadily. Do we understand each other? Yes, sir, she said. Dismissed. She stood. She moved to the door. She had her hand on the handle when he spoke again. Walker. She stopped. Whatever it is you're carrying. A pause. You don't look like someone who's been doing this alone by choice. She stood very still with her hand on the door handle, and she did not turn around. She said, no, sir, I haven't been doing it by choice. She went out. She closed the door behind her. She walked down the corridor with her pace exactly even and her spine exactly straight, and she turned a corner, and she stood with her back against the wall, and she breathed 4 counts and hold, 4 counts out until the thing in her chest that had pressed up hard against the surface went back down to wherever it lived. She had not broken. She had not told him anything real, but she had told him enough to make him feel the edge of it, which was both less than she'd intended to give and more than she'd ever meant to. That afternoon, something happened in the barracks that she hadn't anticipated. She came back from the afternoon session to find Chen sitting on her own bunk with a carefully neutral expression, and Davis sitting on his bunk across the way, looking at the floor, and Torres leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his jaw set. She came through the door, and the specific quality of the silence told her immediately that something had been said. What happened? She said. Not a question, a statement. Torres said Holloway came by. She waited. He was asking questions, Chen said. About you, about whether we'd noticed anything, whether you'd said anything about your background. Something cold moved through her. What did you tell him? Nothing, Torres said before anyone else could answer. He said it with the flat certainty of someone who had already decided this was the position and wasn't open to discussion. We told him nothing. Davis looked up from the floor. He was 19 and uncertain about most things, but his face right now had the look of someone who had managed to be certain about this one. I said I didn't know you very well, which is true, but I didn't say, he stopped. Whatever it is, it felt like it was yours, so I kept it. Maya looked at the three of them. She stood in the doorway of the barracks, and she looked at the three people who had each in their own way covered for a woman they'd known for 8 days for reasons they couldn't fully explain and hadn't required each other to articulate. She felt something move in her chest that she did not have a clean name for. It was not gratitude exactly. It was bigger than that and older than that, and it had teeth. She said, "Thank you." She said it once, and she meant it absolutely. Torres nodded. Chen nodded. Davis looked back at the floor, but the corners of his mouth were doing something that might have been the start of a smile if you gave it enough time and enough safety to become one. That evening after dinner, Maya sat on her bunk in the quiet of the barracks, and she did something she had not done in a very long time. She reached to the bottom of her locker. She moved the items on top carefully one by one. She found the zippered bag. She held it in her hands for a moment without opening it. She thought about Carter's question, "Whatever you're carrying." She thought about Chen saying, "I see you." She thought about Davis keeping her secret at 19 years old because it felt like it was yours. She did not open the bag. She was not ready for that yet. But she held it, and that was different from where she'd been a week ago when she'd put it at the bottom and tried to forget it was there. Holding it was not forgetting. Holding it was acknowledging that it existed, that it was part of her, that the weight of it was real and had her name on it. She put it back. She closed the locker. She sat in the quiet dark of her bunk, and she thought about what Carter had said about continuing to pull the thread, and she knew it was true. He was not going to stop. A man like Carter did not stop. And Holloway asking questions in the barracks was not the end of that process. It was the beginning. And whatever careful architecture she'd built over the past 8 days was going to be tested in ways she hadn't fully calculated yet. But here was the thing she hadn't expected. She wasn't sure anymore that she wanted it to hold. She wasn't sure anymore that disappearing was what she actually needed. She had come here to disappear, and instead she had found Torres and Chen and Davis and a 19-year-old kid who kept secrets because they felt like someone else's to keep. She had found Kowalski's wordless recognition and Carter's question underneath the question. She had found, in spite of everything, the small, persistent gravity of being known. She didn't know what to do with that yet. It was new and it was uncomfortable, and it sat inside her like something she'd swallowed that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to hurt or heal. She didn't know. She lay back on her bunk and she stared at the ceiling and she breathed. In and out, slow, even. Outside, Fort Bragg continued its endless, grinding, indifferent business of making soldiers out of people. Somewhere across the base, Carter was reading a new set of documents that had arrived by a secure channel in response to the second inquiry he'd made, and his expression as he read was very still and very serious. He turned pages. He read. He stopped at one page and read it twice. He set the folder down. He stared at the wall for a moment. Then he said quietly to the empty room, "My God." He picked up his phone. He made a call. And in the barracks, Maya Walker lay in the dark and did not sleep and did not know that the thing she had been trying to outrun had just been found and was making its way to her, and there was nowhere left to go. Carter hadn't slept either. That was the thing nobody on base would have guessed, because Colonel James Carter was the kind of man who projected the specific, settled authority of someone who had made peace with uncertainty a long time ago. He moved through Fort Bragg with the unhurried confidence of a man who had seen enough that very little surprised him anymore, and that projection was real. It wasn't performance. He had earned that steadiness over 31 years of doing difficult things in difficult places. But the folder on his desk had shaken something loose in him, and he sat in his office at 0200 hours with the folder open and a cold cup of coffee beside him, and he read the documents for the third time because the first 2 times he hadn't fully believed what they said. He had made calls. The second call, the one to a contact at the Pentagon, who owed him 3 separate favors and had access to classifications that Carter didn't technically have clearance to request, had taken 40 minutes and had ended with his contact saying very quietly, "Carter, you need to be careful with this one. This woman is not what her file says." And Carter had said, "I know that." And his contact had said, "No, you don't know it yet. I'm going to send you something. Read it before you do anything else." What he had sent arrived by secure channel at 2340 hours. Carter had read it once, put it down, sat in the silence for 4 minutes, and then read it again. Now he was on the third reading, and he still hadn't decided what to do with it. Her name was Maya Walker. She was 28 years old. She had enlisted at 19 the same year her mother died and her college scholarship fell through, and 2 of the 3 options she'd had for her life closed simultaneously. She'd gone to basic training, and then to advanced training, and then to a deployment cycle that had, within 18 months of her enlistment, placed her in contexts that most soldiers never saw in an entire career. Afghanistan. 3 rotations. The first with a standard infantry unit, where she had distinguished herself in ways that got her noticed by people who noticed specific things for specific reasons. The second rotation had a classification level that Carter's contact had not been able to fully detail, even through back channels, which told Carter everything he needed to know about what that rotation had involved. The third rotation, her last, was Kandahar, 2019. The ambush near the Arghandab River that had been referenced in documents circulated at the command level, the one that had resulted in 6 KYA and 4 severe casualties and 1 soldier holding a defensive position alone for 43 minutes until a QRF could reach them. 1 soldier. Carter set the folder down. He looked at the wall. He had known soldiers who held positions. He had been a soldier who held a position once in a situation he still thought about on certain nights. He knew what those 43 minutes felt like from the inside. He knew what they cost. And he knew what it meant that the soldier who had held that position at Kandahar had then been given the Silver Star and the Bronze Star with combat distinction and the Purple Heart, and had then, after a period of leave and evaluation that the documents described in clinical language that made Carter's jaw tight, requested a reassignment to a training cycle at Fort Bragg under a thin file. She wasn't hiding from the military. She was hiding inside it, using its structure the way a person uses a wall, not to build something, but to hold themselves upright while the ground kept moving. He understood that. He didn't like that he understood it, because understanding it meant he had a responsibility to it, and that responsibility was going to complicate the next several days considerably. He closed the folder at 02:30, and he went to the window, and he stood there for a while thinking about what it meant to have survived something that was supposed to be remembered as heroism, but felt from the inside like the worst day of your life. He thought about the recruit who had cried quietly in the dark on the first night, and about Torres and Chen, who had covered for her without being asked, and about Maya Walker lying in her bunk right now with whatever she carried when she closed her eyes. He picked up the folder, he locked it in his desk. He went to make fresh coffee because he wasn't going to sleep, and he needed to be ready for what was coming. What was coming arrived faster than even he had calculated. Day 9. The morning formation was standard. The air was cold and getting colder. November working its way in underneath October, and the 23 recruits stood in their lines with the slightly more settled posture of people who had been doing this for over a week and had started to build the small muscles of routine. Maya stood in her position. She breathed. She managed. It was Torres who noticed the vehicle first. He was in the row behind Maya, and he saw the dark SUV pull up along the far edge of the training ground and stop, and 2 people got out who were not in uniform, and he felt something shift in his chest that he couldn't name. He didn't say anything. He looked straight ahead, but his awareness of that vehicle did not leave him. Holloway dismissed them to the morning training rotation and then turned immediately and walked toward the main building with the purposeful stride of someone who had somewhere specific to be. Maya saw it. She noted the angle of his departure and the fact that he hadn't looked at her before he left, which was new. Holloway had been looking at her before he left every morning for the past 3 days. The absence of the look was its own kind of signal. She went to the morning rotation. She performed. She managed. At 09:30, during a break between drills, Chen appeared at her elbow. "There were people asking about you this morning," Chen said without preamble, because Chen had figured out that preamble was something Maya didn't have much patience for. Not Holloway, different people, in the admin building. Maya kept her face still. "What kind of questions?" Sergeant Reeves was asking Davis about the leadership exercise, specifically about what you said. Davis told him you answered the scenario correctly and he didn't know anything else. Chen paused. "Davis is a better liar than you'd expect from a 19-year-old. "Who is Sergeant Reeves?" Maya asked. "That's the thing," Chen said. "I don't know. I've never seen him before. He's not assigned to this training cycle." The drill instructor called them back, and Maya went back to the rotation, and her mind was moving very fast underneath the still surface she maintained. An outside sergeant asking questions about a specific recruit interaction. That was not standard. That was Carter's follow-through, or the consequence of Carter's follow-through, someone further up the chain responding to whatever inquiry had gone up from his level. The second call she hadn't known about. The documents she hadn't known were being read. The architecture she had built was not just cracking now, it was being disassembled from the outside. She had two options. She had always had two options. She just hadn't wanted to look at them both directly before now. The first option was to accelerate the disappearing push. The request through the channels she still had access to, request a new assignment before Carter could get high enough up the chain to get real answers. It was possible. She still had the contacts. The network she'd built over 9 years of service didn't evaporate because you stopped using it. She could be gone from Fort Bragg in 72 hours if she moved today. The second option was to stay. She thought about staying, and she thought about Carter's face in that conference room, and she thought about Chen saying, "I see you." And she thought about the folder at the bottom of her locker and the weight that came with it. And she thought, if you run again, where are you running to? She had run to Fort Campbell, and it hadn't worked. She had run to 3 different cities in 8 months, and none of them had worked. She had run to Fort Bragg, and she had been here 9 days, and already people were covering for her and sitting across from her at breakfast and making her feel against every defense she'd built something that resembled belonging. Running had a law of diminishing returns. She was starting to feel the ceiling of it. She did not decide anything during the morning rotation. She filed the options away, and she continued to function, and she continued to manage because those were the things she knew how to do. And sometimes knowing what you know how to do is the only thing that gets you through the next hour. The Kill House exercise was scheduled for day 11. It was announced on day 9 at the afternoon briefing, and the announcement moved through the group with the specific quality of news that everyone receives and immediately begins performing their relationship to. Some people perform confidence, some perform calm. Davis performed something that was not quite either, but that had a genuine quality to it. The look of someone who had decided to be braver than they were because they didn't see another option. The Kill House was a live-fire tactical building clearance exercise, the most intense physical training exercise in the basic cycle. Live rounds, controlled conditions, but live rounds and the controlled conditions existed within a margin of error that everyone in the room understood at some level, even if they didn't say it. Real smoke, real disorientation, real consequences for real mistakes. Maya knew the Kill House. She had run similar exercises more times than she could count, in more conditions than she would describe in polite company. She also knew that what made these exercises dangerous was not the competent soldier. It was the competent soldier surrounded by people who weren't the way a chain's strength is a function of its weakest link, not its strongest. She looked around the room at the 23 people she'd spent 9 days with, and she did a silent automatic assessment of each of them, and she identified the 3 most likely to have a serious problem under those conditions, and she felt the specific helpless frustration of someone who could see the shape of what was coming and couldn't fully prevent it without revealing everything she'd been trying to hide. Torres appeared next to her on the walk back from briefing. He matched her pace and he said quietly, "Kill House on Thursday." "I know," she said. "Davis is going to struggle." "I know," she said. "You're going to have to make a choice," Torres said, "in there, whether to let things play out or step in. And if you step in the way you stepped in on the obstacle course—" "I know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" She didn't answer him right away. They walked. The base moved around them, people, vehicles, the constant industrial hum of a place that never stopped. She thought about the 43 minutes outside Kandahar. She thought about the 6 people who hadn't made it back. She thought about what it felt like to be the one who had made it back, to be carrying the specific, impossible weight of having survived when others hadn't, and to know that the weight didn't get lighter by hiding it. It just became more expensive to carry. She said the right thing. Torres looked at her sideways. He said, "Yeah, that's what I figured." He said it like it was an answer he'd already known and had just needed to hear confirmed. That night at 2100 hours, Carter called her to his office again. This time the folder was open on the desk between them. He didn't turn it to face her. He didn't need to. He set his hands flat on the desk and he looked at her and he said, "I know who you are." The room was very quiet. She sat across from him with her hands in her lap and she said nothing because there was nothing to say that would change what those 4 words meant. Kandahar, he said, 2019. She held his gaze. I've read the AAR, he said, after action report, the clinical documented account of what had happened in the Arg-Handub River ambush. The version of events that used phrases like defensive perimeter maintained and fire superiority established and casualties sustained. The version that did not say she stayed when everyone else was down. She held the line alone for 43 minutes in conditions that should have killed her. She called in the positions and maintained communication and did the math on who was still alive and who wasn't and kept moving because moving was the only alternative to dying. I read the whole thing, Aaron Carter said, 3 times. She said, I didn't come here to talk about Kandahar, sir. I know you didn't. He was quiet for a moment. Can I ask you something direct? You've been asking me things direct since day 1, sir. The corner of his mouth moved not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. Fair, here it is. He looked at her steadily. What do you need from this training cycle? Not what the program needs. Not what the thin file says. What do you need? She had not expected that question. She had braced for the confrontation, the official recognition, the formal acknowledgement that would put her back into the system as what she actually was. She had not braced for someone asking what she needed because in her experience, that was not a question that came from command. Command had needs and you met them. Command did not typically turn the question around. She said slowly, I need somewhere that makes sense. She paused. After Kandahar, nothing made sense for a long time. I needed structure. Something that asked specific things of me and didn't care about the rest. He nodded. He understood that. You could see it on his face, not sympathy exactly, but the recognition of someone who had needed similar things at different moments in their own career. The people in this training cycle, he said, they don't know what you are. No, sir. But they're starting to. She was quiet. That exercise on day 2, he said, the weapons handling, the map reading, Ferris's report, Kowalski's report. He paused. Torres's report. She went very still. Torres reported on me. He reported that there was a recruit in his cycle who had demonstrably advanced skills and appeared to be managing them deliberately, and that he felt someone at the command level should be aware before the kill house exercise. Because if something went wrong in there and she had to make a decision, it was going to be a decision that exposed her completely, and he wanted the command to be ready for that. Carter paused. He didn't do it to expose you. He did it to protect you. Maya sat with that for a long moment. Torres, who had told her, I'm not trying, get in your business, and then gone to Carter anyway, not to betray her, but to build a cushion between her and the fall he could see coming. She thought about the way he'd matched her pace on the morning run on day 1. She thought about him saying, what are you going to do, and accepting the answer, the right thing, without pushing further. She said he shouldn't have done that. No, Carter said, he absolutely should have. He looked at her. Walker, I need to ask you something that's outside the official conversation. Sir, are you okay? The question hit her the same way Chen's I see you had hit her in a place she hadn't armored because she hadn't expected anyone to aim there. She held the impact the way she had trained herself to hold impacts with stillness and breath and the disciplined management of what she let show on her face. But her voice when she answered had something in it that hadn't been there before. No, sir, she said. I'm not okay. I'm working on it. He nodded once. That's an honest answer. He looked at her. Here's where we are. The kill house exercise runs Thursday. I'm not pulling you from it. Pulling you would raise more questions than leaving you in. But I need you to understand something. He leaned forward slightly. If something goes wrong in there, I need to know that you're going to make the right call. Not the careful call, the right one. She met his eyes. And if the right call exposes everything, then everything gets exposed, he said simply. And we deal with what comes after. Together. He said the last word with a weight that told her it was not a figure of speech. She left his office at 2200 hours, and she walked back through the cold October night with her hands in her pockets and her mind somewhere between the conversation she just had and the one she was going to have with herself before Thursday. Torres was sitting on his bunk when she came back into the barracks. He was the only one still awake, or the only one openly still awake. He looked at her when she came through the door. She stopped at the end of the row and she looked at him and she said, "You talked to Carter." He held her gaze. He didn't apologize. "I talked to Carter. I told you I was managing it." "You told me you were managing it," he agreed, "and I believed you. And then I thought about you inside a kill house with Davis in a live round malfunction and your instincts making a decision that you hadn't gotten to choose yet." He paused. "I didn't do it to blow your cover. I did it so that when your cover blew itself, and it was going to blow itself, that there was someone at the command level who already knew you were worth catching." She stood there. She looked at him. She said, "That was not your call to make." "No," he said, "it wasn't. I made it anyway." He didn't look away. "I'd make it again." She stood there for another moment. Then she walked to her bunk. She sat down. She reached into her locker, not all the way to the bottom, just the middle shelf, and she took out a water bottle and drank from it and set it back. She lay down. She looked at the ceiling. From across the aisle, Torres said quietly, "You doing okay?" "No," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Me either, most days." The barracks were quiet around them. Davis's breathing had evened into sleep. Chen's had too. Outside, Fort Bragg did what Fort Bragg always did, which was continue, which was not pause, which was move forward with or without you. Maya lay in the dark, and she thought about Thursday, and she thought about the kill house, and she thought about what Carter had said, the right call, not the careful one. And she knew with a deep and specific certainty of someone who had already been in enough rooms with that choice in them exactly what the right call was going to be. She just didn't know yet whether she was ready to be what it required her to be. She thought about Sarah. She let herself think about Sarah, which she didn't often allow, because thinking about Sarah was like touching a wound to see if it had healed and usually finding out it hadn't. She thought about Sarah's voice and Sarah's particular brand of direct honesty and the way Sarah used to say in the flat, useful tone she had for important things, "Stop calculating and do the right thing, Maya. The calculation will take care of itself." She had not been able to do the right thing when Sarah died. She had done the possible thing, and the possible thing had not been enough, and she had been carrying the distance between those two things ever since. Maybe Thursday was about something else. Maybe Thursday wasn't about being caught or exposed or having the careful architecture of her disappearing come apart in a live fire exercise. Maybe Thursday was about the choice she'd been circling for 8 months, the one she kept running toward and then veering away from at the last second, because making it meant accepting something she wasn't sure she could survive accepting. Sarah was gone. The others were gone. She was not gone. And the question was not why she was still here. She had stopped being able to answer that question, but what she was going to do with the fact that she was. She closed her eyes. She breathed. She did not sleep, but the breathing helped and the quiet helped. And somewhere in the small hours of the morning, exhaustion finally pulled her under into something that was not quite sleep, but was close enough to pass. Thursday was 2 days away. The kill house was waiting. And in the base medical office, a report had been filed by a training observer that flagged a recruit's anomalous performance patterns for review by senior command, a report that Carter had read and countersigned with the notation that said, "Under observation, do not intervene, command aware." Something was coming. She could feel it, the way she felt everything in the specific bone-deep register of someone whose instincts had been calibrated by years of learning, that the feeling you had 3 seconds before everything changed was a feeling worth paying attention to. She paid attention to it. She breathed. She held herself steady in the dark, and she waited for Thursday, and she let herself, for the first time in a very long time, be afraid. Wednesday night, Maya did not pretend to sleep. She sat on the edge of her bunk in the dark with her hands open in her lap, and she let the night be what it was, long and quiet and full of the particular weight that comes the night before something you cannot avoid anymore. She had stopped trying to calculate her way through it. She had run the numbers so many times in the past 48 hours that the numbers had stopped meaning anything, and what was left underneath them was something simpler and harder than math. Tomorrow was the kill house. Tomorrow, one way or another, everything she had spent 11 days managing was going to be tested in a room with live rounds and real smoke, and 22 other people who didn't fully know what they were standing next to. She thought about Carter saying the right call, not the careful one. She thought about Torres sitting across the aisle in the dark 2 nights ago saying me either most days, like it was the most natural thing in the world to admit that surviving did not mean okay. She thought about Davis, 19 years old from somewhere in Georgia, who had cried quietly on the first night and kept her secret because it felt like it was yours. She thought about all of them. This group of 23 strangers who had become something she didn't have a clean word for over the past 11 days. And she thought about what it would mean if something went wrong in that building tomorrow, and she had to choose between her cover and their safety. She already knew the answer. She had known the answer since Carter put the choice in those specific words. She just needed the night to finish making peace with what knowing it was going to cost. At 0200, Taurus's voice came quietly from across the aisle. You awake? Yeah, she said, a pause. You want company or quiet? She thought about it honestly. Company, she said, and surprised herself with how much she meant it. He sat up. He didn't move across the aisle, just stayed sitting on the edge of his bunk with his forearms on his knees facing her direction in the dark. It was the most private kind of conversation, two people who couldn't fully see each other talking into the space between their bunks. Tell me something, she said. What kind of something? Something real. Something that happened to you that you didn't choose to talk about. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Second tour, Fallujah. I had a kid under my command, 20 years old from Minnesota. This big, cheerful kid who called his mother every Sunday and always had something to say about the weather, like it was still a normal topic. He got hit on a Tuesday, not killed injured, but bad enough that he was out going home. Torres paused. He cried when they told him he was going home. Not because he was hurt, because he didn't want to leave his unit. I never forgot that. 20 years old, bad injury, and the thing he was most upset about was leaving. She listened. I thought about that a lot, Torres said, about what it means that he didn't want to leave, about whether that was beautiful or terrible or both at the same time. He paused. I still think it's both. She said, what was his name? Perez. Eddie Perez. He said it like the name was worth saying carefully. He's doing okay now. I checked a couple years back. He coaches youth football somewhere in Minnesota. She held that in the dark for a moment. That's good, she said. Yeah, he said. It is. They sat in the quiet for a while after that, not talking, just existing in the same space, which was its own kind of thing, the specific comfort of another person's wakefulness when sleep won't come. Eventually, she lay back down. He did too, she said. Torres. Yeah. Thank you for Carter. I know I said it wasn't your call. It wasn't, he said. No, she said, but thank you anyway. She heard him settle back onto his bunk. She closed her eyes. She didn't sleep, but she rested, which was something, and something was more than nothing, and sometimes that was the arithmetic that had to get you through to morning. Thursday is 0445. The lights came on and Maya was already sitting up. The Kill House briefing was at 800. The exercise ran from 900. 4 hours to get through before the thing that couldn't be avoided anymore arrived. And Maya moved through those 4 hours with the clean, deliberate pace of someone who has decided something fundamental and is now simply waiting for the moment to enact it. She ate breakfast. She ran the morning rotation. She did not feel the cold or the pace or the specific discomfort of the exercises the way she normally tracked them, because her awareness was running on a different frequency than the physical one, processing something larger and slower that required most of her attention. Chen caught up with her at 0730 coming out of the equipment room where they'd been gearing up. She fell into step with Maya, and they walked for a moment without talking, and then Chen said, whatever happens in there today, I've got your back. Maya looked at her sideways. You don't know what might happen. I know enough, Chen said. I've been watching you for 11 days. I know what you do when things go wrong. I know you move toward the problem instead of away from it. And I know that wherever you came from, that habit didn't come from nothing. She paused. I don't need to know the details. I just need you to know you're not alone in there. Maya stopped walking. Chen stopped too. They stood facing each other, and Maya looked at Chen's face, open, direct, certain, and she felt the same thing she'd felt twice before when people had said things she hadn't expected that specific impact in a place she hadn't thought to defend. She said, you're going to be a good soldier. Chen's chin lifted slightly. I know, she said without arrogance, just the clean confidence of someone who has done an honest assessment and believes the result. So are you. They went to the briefing. Lieutenant Ferris ran at the same Ferris whose notes had changed when Maya answered the leadership scenario on day 6. He stood at the front of the room with a layout diagram behind him, and he walked them through the kill house structure, the rotation plan, the safety protocols, the communication system. He was thorough. He was clear. He looked at two specific moments in the briefing directly at Maya, and each time she met his eyes and he looked away first. The kill house had three connected sections. Section 1 was a hallway clearance. Section 2 was a room entry and control scenario. Section 3 was a casualty extraction under simulated fire. Each section had a designated point person rotating through the group, and the point assignments had been made in advance. Maya was assigned to Section 2. Davis was assigned to Section 3. She noted this when Ferris read out the assignments. She noted it the way she noted everything, fast automatic, filed into the part of her brain where operational information went. Section 3 was the hardest section. Section 3 was where the live round interaction with the simulated fire was closest. Section 3 was where the highest probability of a stress response mistake existed in an underprepared recruit. Davis was assigned to Section 3. Davis, who was 19 and from Georgia and had cried on the first night and told Sergeant Reeves he didn't know anything because it felt like it was yours. She looked at Davis across the room. He was sitting with his back straight and his jaw set, and the look of someone trying very hard to perform a confidence they were still building from scratch. He caught her looking. He gave her a nod that was small and deliberate, the kind of nod that says, "I know, and I'm going anyway." She nodded back. The group geared up at 0845. Equipment check, safety confirmation, communication device test. Maya moved through the equipment check with the automatic efficiency of someone for whom this process was reflex, and she caught at least two moments where instructors who were observing the group paused on her and looked at their clipboards and looked back at her and wrote something down. She let them. She had passed the point where managing their observations mattered. What mattered now was the next 45 minutes. At 900, they entered a room. The first section was controlled chaos, which was the point. The hallway clearance simulation moved fast. Smoke deployed at 60 seconds, communication became difficult at 90, and the designated point person for Section 1 was a recruit named Sullivan who was technically solid, but froze for 3 seconds when the smoke hit, which caused a cascade of hesitation through the people behind him. Maya was third in the line. She watched Sullivan freeze. She watched the people behind him compress and lose their spacing. She said loudly and calmly, "Sullivan, left wall, move." And Sullivan moved, and the line reorganized, and they cleared Section 1 in 4 minutes and 12 seconds, which was within acceptable parameters. The Section 1 observer wrote something on his clipboard. Maya didn't look at him. Section 2 was hers. She took the point position, and she felt a specific, familiar weight of being the person at the front, the one the decisions flowed back from, the one whose hesitation or certainty propagated through everyone behind them, like a signal through a wire. She felt it, and she let herself feel it, and she did not manage it down the way she'd been managed everything else for 11 days. She let it be what it was, her natural state, the thing she had been for years. Before Kandahar broke something loose in her that had taken all this time to begin finding its way back. She moved through Section 2 clean and fast. Room entry at the correct angle. Communication relayed in both directions without breaking stride. The simulated hostile contact in the far corner of the room required a decision in under 2 seconds, and she made it in one, and the 3 recruits behind her executed on her call with the kind of trust that people extend to certainty, not because they know you, but because certainty in a crisis is its own credentials. They cleared Section 2 in 2 minutes and 50 seconds. The observer at the Section 2 exit stared at her for a full 3 seconds before writing anything down. And then they moved to Section 3, and everything fell apart in exactly the way she had feared it would. The transition between Section 2 and Section 3 involved a narrow doorway and a shift in the smoke density thicker in 3 intentionally designed to elevate disorientation. Davis was waiting at the Section 3 entry point to take the lead, and when Maya came through the doorway, she could already see in his posture that he was at the edge of himself. Not broken, not done, but close to the place where stress response overrides training and the body starts making decisions that the mind doesn't fully authorize. She moved behind him. She said low directly at his ear, "Davis, I've got you. Listen to my voice." He heard her. His shoulders dropped 1 degree from the rigid, overlocked position they'd been in. He said tightly, "I'm good." "I know you are," she said. "Take the first room. I'm right behind you." He moved. He took the first room with the clumsy but functional form of someone pushing through fear rather than waiting for it to pass, and Maya moved with the group behind him, and for 90 seconds it was working, the kind of imperfect, gritty, real working that is sometimes more meaningful than clean precision because it costs more. Then the malfunction happened. It was a training equipment failure not unprecedented, but rare and always alarming. The simulated fire system in the far corner of Section 3 misfired, sending a burst of actual sparks instead of the flash simulation it was supposed to generate. The sparks caught the edge of the smoke canister housing and produced a sharp, bright flash and a wave of real heat in a sound that was not the controlled pop of a training device, but something louder and less managed. 22 people who had been operating at the edge of their stress capacity lurched past that edge simultaneously. The room went sideways in about 4 seconds. 2 recruits near the back pressed backward toward the Section 2 doorway, creating a compression. A recruit named Park, who was carrying the Section 3 safety marker, dropped it and reached instinctively for the weapon at his hip, not deliberately, not with intent, but with the reflexive motion of someone whose body had decided faster than their brain that this was the kind of situation that required the weapon. Davis at the front had stopped completely. Frozen. Not cowardice, something older and more physiological than cowardice. The system shock that happens when the volume of threat exceeds what a person has trained their nervous system to handle. The smoke was heavy and thickening. The heat from the misfired spark was real. Someone in the back made a sound that was close to a shout. Park's hand was on his weapon. Maya had already moved. She covered the distance to Park in 2 seconds, not running, but the fast, low movement of someone who has covered that kind of distance before in conditions that did not permit running, and she put her hand over his firm, certain completely, without aggression. Park, hand off the weapon, right now. He looked at her. His eyes were wide and the whites were showing, and he was somewhere between training and panic, and she held his gaze with the specific, grounded certainty of someone who needed him to be here with her right now. Park, with me. Hand. He released the weapon. His whole body shuddered with the release of the tension that had been in it. She turned. Davis was still frozen at the front. She moved to him, put one hand on his shoulder, and said directly into his ear, "Davis, 3 things. Tell me 3 things you can feel right now." He blinked. His training surfaced through the shock. She could see it happening, the slow reemergence of the person under the panic. He said, "Floor, my gear, your hand." "Good," she said. "That's good. Now, listen. We are moving everyone out through the Section 2 door. You are going to lead. I am going to be right behind you." "Okay." "Okay," he said. His voice was not steady, but it was present, and present was enough. She turned to the group. The smoke was at critical density and getting worse, and she had approximately 90 seconds before the section filled past the safety threshold. She pitched her voice to carry without being loud the particular frequency of command that cuts through noise and fear and makes people stop being individuals and start being a unit. "Everyone on me, single file. Park, you're behind Davis. Chen, you've got the rear count. Tell me when everyone's through the door. Move. Now." They moved. It took 93 seconds. 93 seconds to get 22 people organized and through the doorway in a space filling with smoke and the residual heat of a malfunctioning piece of equipment, with 2 recruits who had been close to seriously bad decisions 30 seconds earlier, now moving with the focused, directed purpose of people who had been told what to do by someone who clearly knew what they were doing. Chen came through last. "All 22, she said. "Everyone's through." Maya came through the door last of all. She turned and she pulled the door closed, and she stood in the relative clarity of the Section 2 space, and she breathed 4 counts in, 4 counts out, while behind her the 22 people she had just extracted were doing various versions of the same thing, processing, trembling, slightly some bent over their knees, Davis sitting against the wall with his head down, doing the 3 things exercise she'd taught him on the fly 30 seconds ago. The Section 3 observer was standing at the far wall. He had not moved during any of it. He had his hand pressed to the radio at his ear, and he was speaking in a low, rapid voice, and whatever he was saying, the word he kept repeating was Walker. Maya stood in the doorway with the smoke still curling around the edges of the closed door, and she thought, that's it. That's the end of the cover. Every calculation she'd made, every carefully managed performance, every deliberately ordinary answer, or all of it was gone, burned off in 93 seconds, the same way the spark had burned off the Section 3 smoke canister housing, fast and bright, and leaving something exposed that couldn't be covered back up. She felt it going. She felt the weight of the careful architecture she'd built coming down, and she waited for the feeling she'd been dreading: the exposure, the loss of the one shelter she'd thought she could build here, the specific sharp grief of a plan that had worked until it didn't. What she felt instead was something she hadn't anticipated. She felt lighter, not fixed, not healed, not suddenly okay, but lighter the way you feel when you have been holding something at arm's length for so long that your muscles have forgotten what it's like not to be working, and then you finally set it down and you feel the absence of the strain before you feel anything else. She had moved towards the problem. She had made the call. She had done the thing she did. The thing she had always done, the thing Kandahar had not removed from her. It had broken something, but it had not removed this. The instinct to cover the person next to you. The refusal to stand still when people were in danger. The decision to be what you were, regardless of what it cost. She hadn't saved anyone in Kandahar. She had held the position and 6 people had still died, and she had been carrying that weight for over a year, like it was penance she deserved. But she had saved 22 people just now. Not from combat, not from anything that was going to follow them home. But she had moved toward the problem and made the call, and they were all standing here breathing because of it. Sarah's voice, very clear, very direct, the way it sounded in the specific memory. She kept locked in the back of the locked room. Stop calculating and do the right thing, Maya. She had done the right thing. Torres appeared at her shoulder. He had been in the back third of the group during the exercise, and he had watched every second of the last 93 with the expression of a man having something he already suspected confirmed in the most unambiguous possible terms. He stood beside her now, and he didn't say anything, and she didn't say anything, and they stood together in the Section 2 space while the group recovered around them. After a moment, Torres said very quietly, "Eddie Perez cried because he didn't want to leave his unit." She looked at him. "Because some things," Torres said, "you don't want to run away from, even when they're hard, even when they cost you." He paused. "Even when you think you're not ready." She looked at him for a long moment. "Yeah," she said. The radio on the Section 3 observer's hip crackled. She heard Carter's voice, calm and clear, come through it. "Get Walker to my office when the group is stable, and tell her to take her time." The observer looked at her. She looked at him. She said, "Tell him 10 minutes." The observer relayed it. The radio crackled again. Carter said, "Understood." She turned back to the group. Davis was still sitting against the wall with his head down, and she crossed to him and crouched in front of him and said, "Davis." He looked up. His eyes were red at the edges, but steady. He said, "I froze." "For 4 seconds," she said. "Then you moved." "You had to." "I had to help you through it," she said. "That's different from you failing. Everyone freezes. The question is what happens next." She paused. "You moved Davis. That's what counts." He looked at her for a moment with the specific expression of a 19-year-old who is trying to decide if what he's been told is true or just something someone is saying to make him feel better. She held his gaze until he found what he was looking for in it, which was that she meant it. He said, "Who are you?" She held his gaze for one more second. Then she stood up. She said, "Someone who froze once too," and moved. She walked toward the main building, and behind her, the 22 people she had just led through a genuine crisis watched her go with the specific, wordless attention of people who have just seen something they don't have a category for yet, but know they will not forget. Park stood with a hand at his side where the weapon had been, and he thought about the 2 seconds when he hadn't been fully in control of what his hand was doing, and the person who had stepped between that and everything it could have become. He thought about how fast she had moved and how certain her voice had been. He thought about the fact that no one in this training cycle was trained to do what she had just done. Chen watched Maya's back as she crossed toward the main building and thought about, "I see you," and thought about how that had been the beginning of something she hadn't fully understood at the time, but understood now. She had seen a woman holding something too heavy to carry invisibly. She was watching her set it down. Torres stood in the middle of the recovered group, and he felt with the deep and specific certainty of someone who had been in enough places to know the difference, that something had just shifted that was not going to shift back. In his office, Colonel Carter opened the folder on his desk for the 4th time. He turned to the page he had read 3 times already, the Kandahar AAR, the 43 minutes, the list of names. He looked at it. He thought about the woman who was walking toward his building right now, who had spent 11 days trying to disappear and had just spent 93 seconds doing the most visible thing she had ever done on this base. He closed the folder. He put it aside. He stood up and went to his window, and he waited, and he thought about what came next. Not the official process, not the administrative consequence, but the human thing. The conversation he was going to have with a 28-year-old woman who had been carrying a war inside her for over a year and had just in a smoky training building in October taken the first step toward putting it down. Outside his window, she came through the base's main pathway with her shoulders straight and her stride even, and the cold morning light of Fort Bragg falling across her face, and from where Carter stood, she looked like exactly what she was. Not a recruit, not a mystery, not a file. A soldier who had come back from somewhere terrible and was one day at a time, one decision at a time, figuring out how to be what she'd always been. And this time, finally, she wasn't doing it alone. She knocked on Carter's door at exactly 10 minutes. Not 9, not 11, 10, because that was what she had said. And she had spent enough of the last 11 days being something less than precise that she was done rounding down. She knocked and he said, "Come in," and she opened the door and stepped inside and closed it behind her. And for a moment, they simply looked at each other across the width of his office, the colonel who had spent 11 days pulling a thread, and the soldier who had spent 11 days hoping he wouldn't find the end of it. He said, "Sit down, Walker." She sat. He didn't sit immediately. He stood at the window for a moment with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at something outside, and she had the sense that he was choosing his first words carefully. Not the official ones, not the command level ones, but the human ones, which were harder. Then he turned and he sat across from her, and he opened the folder on the desk and he turned it around to face her. She looked at it. Her own record. Her actual record, not the thin ghost file that had carried her through the front gates 11 days ago. Her name at the top, her dates of service, her unit assignments, her commendations, her after-action citations. She had not seen this document laid out in front of her since the evaluation period after Kandahar, and seeing it now had the quality of looking at a photograph of yourself taken during something hard. You recognize the person, but you can't fully connect to the fact that it was you. Carter said, "I want you to look at it, not at me, at it." She looked at it. Silver star, bronze star with valor device, purple heart, the dates of the Kandahar ambush. The citation language that described in the measured formal vocabulary of military documentation what she had done in those 43 minutes. She read the words and she felt them land in the specific heavy way they always landed. Not with pride, not with the clean satisfaction of accomplishment, but with the weight of everything those words stood for and everything they left out. "What do you feel when you read that?" Carter said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Like it's someone else, is it?" She looked up from the folder. She met his eyes. "It feels like someone else," she said. "That's different from being someone else." He nodded slowly. "Tell me about Sarah." The name hit her like a physical thing. She had not expected him to say it, had not expected the name to be in any document he'd been given access to, had not expected him to use it the way he used it, quietly and directly, without softening it into a reference or a notation. Just the name, Sarah. She said, "How do you know about Sarah?" "Her name is in the AAR, he said. "Staff Sergeant Sarah Okafor. KIA in the ambush. She was he checked the document, your spotter for the final 2 rotations. Your closest partner in the unit." Maya's jaw tightened. The specific tension of someone who is holding something very carefully because they know exactly how much damage it will do if they stop holding it. "She was my best friend," she said. The words were out before she'd fully decided to say them, and she felt them in the air between them like something breakable. Carter did not try to catch them or wrap them in anything. He just let them be there, which was the right thing to do. "Tell me about her," he said again. Maya looked at the folder. She looked at her hands. She had not talked about Sarah, not really talked about her, not the actual Sarah, not the person, and not the loss with anyone, since a chaplain at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center who had sat with her in a bare room 3 days after Kandahar and asked questions she hadn't been able to answer. She had been asked about Sarah in debriefs, in evaluations, in the careful clinical language of post-incident psychological assessment, and she had answered those questions with the careful clinical responses of someone who understood what those processes needed from her and gave them exactly that and nothing else. Carter was not asking a clinical question. He was asking a human one. And she was so tired, so deeply, fundamentally tired of giving the clinical answer. She said she was direct, unflinchingly direct. You always knew where you stood with Sarah, which sounds like a simple thing, but it isn't because most people spend enormous energy managing what other people think of them. Sarah just told you. She'd say, your plan is wrong, and here's why, and here's what to do instead, and she'd say it without any of the padding people usually put around hard things. Maya paused. I used to find it exhausting. Then I found it the most restful thing in the world because you didn't have to wonder. Carter listened. She had this laugh, Maya said, completely disproportionate to the size of her. She was 5'4", and when something struck her as genuinely funny, she laughed like someone twice her size, and it was the most... She stopped. She pressed her lips together for a moment. Then she said, it was the most alive sound I'd ever heard. And I keep thinking that the world should have a Sarah-shaped space in it somewhere. That something that alive should have left a bigger mark on the physical world than a name in an after-action report. The room was very quiet. Carter said gently, she left a mark on you. Maya looked up at him. Her eyes were clear, but the effort of keeping them clear was visible now in a way that she had stopped trying to hide because she was done managing what he saw. Yeah, she said. She did. Carter was quiet for a moment, then he said, I lost someone too. Captain Frank DeLeon, 2003 Mosul. He was the best officer I'd ever served under, and a better man than that. And I spent about 18 months after that carrying something I didn't have a name for and refusing to put it down because putting it down felt like leaving him behind. He paused. It took me a long time to understand that carrying the weight wasn't the same as honoring the person. That the people who love us don't want us bent. They want us whole. She held that in the silence for a long moment. She said, Sarah used to say, stop calculating and do the right thing. Like it was simple. Like the calculation was always the obstacle and the right thing was always obvious. She almost smiled, not quite, but almost. She wasn't wrong, but she also wasn't the one left alive trying to figure out which calculation to let go of first. Carter said, what calculation have you been running? Walker, the real one. She looked at him. She'd been running this calculation since Kandahar, in every empty apartment in every city she'd tried to disappear into. In every night she'd lain awake running the same numbers that never came out differently, no matter how many times she ran them. She had been running this calculation for over a year, and it had cost her sleep and structure, and the version of herself she'd been before everything broke open in the Arkhandab River Valley. She said whether I deserved to come back. The words fell into the room and she felt the weight of them leave her. Not completely, not finally, but the first real reduction in that weight since the day she'd walked out of Landstuhl and gotten in a car and driven somewhere without a destination. Like setting down one side of a thing you've been carrying with both hands and your arms shaking with the effort of holding just the other side, but the shaking itself proof that the weight has decreased. Carter looked at her for a long time. He said, you held that position for 43 minutes. 6 people died, she said, the reflex answer, the one she'd carried so long it came out automatically. 6 people died, he said. And without you, the number would have been higher, significantly higher. The AAR makes that clear. He paused. That's not something I'm saying to make you feel better. That's what the documentation says. And the documentation was written by people who were there and have no reason to be kind about the math. He leaned forward. You didn't survive Kandahar because you were lucky, Walker. You survived because of who you are. And who you are is exactly the person those 6 people trusted to make the calls they needed someone to make. She sat with that. She let it in instead of deflecting it, which took more effort than anything she'd done in the kill house that morning. She let it sit next to the other truth, the 6 names, the weight, the survivor's arithmetic she'd been running, and she let them both be true simultaneously, which was the hardest thing. The thing she'd been avoiding, because holding 2 truths at the same time required more capacity than holding one, and she had not been sure she had the capacity left. But she was here. She was sitting in this chair in this office, and she had 93 seconds of evidence that she still had it, that it had not been taken from her, that the thing Kandahar had broken loose was not the essential thing. The essential thing was still there, had been there the whole time, had been sitting at the bottom of her, like the metals sat at the bottom of the locker, covered over, not gone. She said, what happens now? Carter said, what do you want to happen? She hadn't been asked that in 18 months. The question landed with a small, precise shock, the surprise of something she had genuinely not expected. Not what does the program require, not what does your file say, not what are your options as determined by the system you're inside. What do you want? She thought about it honestly. She thought about the 22 people in that training cycle, and Davis against the wall doing a three things exercise, and Chen at the back of the line counting heads, and Torres moving without hesitation toward the problem the same way she did. She thought about what it had felt like to be at the front of the Section 2 rotation with the full weight of her actual ability, running in her hands and her voice without apology, without management, without the careful performance of being something smaller. She said, "I want to be useful." Carter nodded once. Like that was the answer he'd been waiting for since he first saw her step off the bus 11 days ago. "Then I have a proposal." He closed the folder. He put it aside the same way he'd put it aside before she arrived, like it had done its work and was no longer needed. He looked at her directly and he said, "There's a senior combat instructor position that opened up 6 weeks ago. Tactics, survival psychology, leadership under pressure. We've been looking for the right person." He paused. "I'm looking at the right person." She stared at him. "I came here as a recruit. You came here as a decorated combat veteran with a thin file and a good reason for it," he said. "The recruit part was logistics. This is operational." He held her gaze. "You spent 11 days teaching people without meaning to. The obstacle course, the leadership scenario, the kill house this morning. You can't turn it off, Walker. It's all what you do. The only question is whether you do it officially or whether we keep pretending you're something you're not." The room was quiet. She heard the bass outside, the constant forward-moving machinery of it, indifferent and continuous, and always asking people to be something, and then asking more of them after that. She thought about running. She noticed the reflex, the old familiar pull toward the next assignment, the next thin file, the next place where no one knew her name. She noticed it and she identified it for what it was, which was not survival instinct, not protection, not self-preservation in any meaningful sense. It was habit, and habits could be changed. She said, "The recruits would know who I am." "Yes," Carter said. "Everything I've been, all of it." "Yes." "You'd tell them about Kandahar." He was quiet for a moment. "That would be your call to make," he said. "Not mine. What I tell them is that their instructor has been where they're trying to go and came back, and that experience is the most valuable thing this base has to offer anyone going into the field." He paused. "The rest is yours. You tell them what you choose to tell them when you choose to tell it." She sat with that, the shape of it, the weight of it, which was different from the weight she'd been carrying, not lighter exactly, but distributed differently, spread across a purpose, instead of concentrated in a grief. And that difference changed what you could carry and for how long. She said, "I need time." "You have until Monday," he said. "That's 72 hours. But Walker, he waited until she looked at him directly. "Stop running the survival calculation. You know the answer. You've known it since you walked into that kill house this morning." She stood. She moved to the door. She had her hand on the handle for the second time in the history of her conversations with Colonel Carter in this office, and this time he didn't call her back with a final question. He said, "Walker." She stopped. "Welcome to Fort Bragg," he said, "the real version." She went out. The base received her back into itself the way it always did, without ceremony, without adjustment, with the steady, indifferent continuation of everything that was always happening, regardless of what happened to any individual inside it. She walked the main path and she felt the cold on her face, and she felt the 63 hours of sleep deficit in her body, and she felt the residual adrenaline of the kill house still metabolizing through her system. And underneath all of it, she felt something she had not felt in over a year. She felt like herself, not the self she'd been performing for 11 days, not the thin file administrative transfer who moved carefully inside the lines and managed every output with deliberate precision. The actual self, the one that ran toward problems, the one that made calls in smoke-filled rooms, the one that had held a position for 43 minutes and was still here walking across Fort Bragg in October with the cold on her face and 72 hours to make a decision she had already made. Torres was waiting for her outside the barracks. He was sitting on the steps with his forearms on his knees, and he stood up when he saw her coming, and he didn't say anything. Just stood there with the patient, steady quality. He had the quality that had been offering her something since day one, that she'd kept almost accepting and then pulling back from. She stopped in front of him. She looked at him. She said, "Carter offered me a position." His eyebrows went up slightly. "What kind of position?" "Senior combat instructor." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you going to take it?" She said, "Yeah, I think I am." Something in his face, the tension she hadn't fully noticed until it released, came down. He exhaled through his nose in a way that was almost a laugh, the kind of sound that happens when relief and something like joy at the same time and can't both fit through the normal expressions. He said, "Good." She said, "I need to do something first." He looked at her. He waited. She went inside. She went to her bunk. She reached to the bottom of her locker, past everything she'd stacked on top of it, and she found the zippered bag and she took it out. She held it in her hands for a moment, the same way she'd held it 2 nights ago in the dark, feeling the weight of the metal through the fabric. Then she unzipped it. The uniform was folded the precise flat way that military dress uniforms are folded by people who understand what that precision represents. She unfolded it. She held it up and she looked at the medals attached to the chest, and she felt the full weight of each one, not the physical weight, which was negligible, but the other weight, the one she'd been carrying since each of them had been placed there. The Silver Star was for valor under fire in conditions that should not have been survivable. It was for 43 minutes in the Arghandab River Valley. It was for the decision to stay when the calculation said go, because the calculation did not account for the 6 people who needed someone to stay. The Bronze Star with distinction was for 2 prior decisions in 2 prior deployments. Moments she remembered differently than the language of the citation described them as terrifying and costly and necessary rather than distinguished. The Purple Heart was for the shrapnel she'd taken in the left shoulder during the same ambush that killed Sarah. It was for the specific physical fact of having been in that place and survived it. It was for the scar she still carried and the ghost of the pain that still woke her sometimes in the early morning hours and brought everything back with it. She had hated these medals because they were receipts, because looking at them was looking at the cost documented in metal, and the cost was too high, and she had been so angry for so long at the fact that they existed that the institution had looked at everything she'd lost and everything she'd paid and said, "Here, have a pin," as if the pin made any of it make sense. She looked at them now, and she thought about what Carter had said: people who love us don't want us bent. They want us whole. She thought about Sarah, who would have had approximately 0 patience for the way Maya had spent the past year. Who would have said something direct and slightly brutal and entirely accurate about the difference between honoring the dead and using the dead as a reason to stop living? Who would have laughed that disproportionate laugh and said, "Maya, I swear you make everything harder than it has to be"? She almost smiled. It almost became a real smile. She let it. Chen came through the barracks door and stopped when she saw Maya standing there holding the uniform. She looked at the medals on the chest. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Is that yours?" "Yes," Maya said. Chen crossed the room. She stood next to Maya, and she looked at the medals with the careful attention of someone reading something that deserves to be read slowly. She said quietly, "Silver Star." "Yes." "What for?" Maya looked at the medal. She said, "For staying when I should have run." Chen looked at her. She said, "I think that's the bravest thing I've ever heard." The words arrived without warning and hit exactly the place they hit, which was the place Maya had spent over a year keeping armored. She felt her jaw tighten, and she held it 4 counts and hold 4 counts out, and then she let it go. The armor. Not completely, not forever, because you don't dismantle something built over years in a single afternoon, but a section of it, a wall width of it. She said she was braver. My friend, Sarah. She paused. She was the braver one. Maybe, Chen said, but she's not here. You are. She paused. And so am I. And Davis, who is currently in the common room eating his 3rd bowl of cereal, because apparently almost crises make him hungry. And Torres, who has been sitting outside for the past 20 minutes pretending he wasn't waiting for you. She looked at Maya directly. You're not alone in this, whatever it is. Maya looked at the uniform in her hands. She looked at the medals. She thought about being alone, the apartment, the cities, the long nights, and the mornings that had no structure to hold her upright, and the calculations she'd been running, that never came out right, no matter how many times she ran it. She thought about 11 days in a barracks with 22 strangers who had become without her permission. Something she didn't have a clean word for, but felt clearly. The weight of belonging. The specific gravity of being known. She said, Chen, yeah, thank you for everything you said. All of it. Chen looked at her for a moment with the direct, open quality. She had the quality that didn't soften things unnecessarily, but also didn't make them harder than they needed to be. She said, don't thank me. Just stay. Maya looked at her. Then she looked at the uniform in her hands. Then she made the decision, the real one, the complete one, the one she'd been circling for over a year and had finally gotten close enough to make, and she felt it settle into her. The way right decisions settle, not with fanfare, but with the quiet, irreversible certainty of something that has found the place it belongs. Sunday morning, she went to Carter's office. She knocked. He said, come in. She opened the door and she was wearing her full dress uniform, the real one, the actual one, the one with the silver star and the bronze star and the purple heart and her name and her rank and her record on her chest where anyone with eyes could see it. She had put it on that morning, standing in the barracks before anyone else was awake, and she had stood in front of the small mirror at the end of the room for a long time, looking at the woman in it, making herself look until the woman looking back stopped feeling like someone else. She walked into Carter's office and she stood at attention and she said, Opa, I accept the position, sir. Carter looked at her. He looked at the uniform. Something in his face moved, not sentimentality, not performance, but the genuine response of a man who had seen enough things in 31 years to know which ones mattered. He stood up. He came around the desk. He extended his hand and she took it and he said, welcome back, Instructor Walker. The Monday morning formation was the first one that Maya Walker attended as herself. Not as an administrative transfer with a thin file, not as a recruit carefully managing what she showed. As Instructor Walker, the designation Carter had given her that morning, the one that was now reflected in the updated orders that had moved through the system with the quiet efficiency of command decisions that have been decided at the right level. She stood at the front of the formation for the first time on the other side of the line, and the 22 recruits who had been her group stood in their positions and looked at her. They knew by then. Word had moved through the barracks the way all significant information moves in a small, closed community, fast and total. Davis had heard from Chen, who had heard it from Torres, who had been present for enough of it to piece together the shape of it. And by Sunday evening, the entire training all knew that the woman who had been in their barracks for 11 days, the woman who had led them out of the Section 2 doorway in 93 seconds with smoke at critical density, was a decorated combat veteran with a silver star and an after-action report that people at the command level read 3 times before they believed it. They knew, and they had had all of Sunday to decide what to do with that knowledge, and what they had decided collectively, and without coordinating it, was this. They were going to do exactly what Torres had done 11 days ago, which was show up and be present and let her know that whatever she was carrying, she didn't have to carry it alone in their company. When Maya took her position at the front of the formation, Davis was the first one to straighten his spine an extra degree. Not performatively, just more. Like the presence of someone who had done hard things and come back required something more from the people standing in front of them, and he wanted to give it. Chen followed. Torres was already straight. He was always straight, but something in his posture shifted with the specific quality of someone who has been waiting for a thing to become what it actually was and is now watching it happen. One by one down the line, the 22 recruits stood just slightly more of what they could be. It was not a movie moment. Nobody saluted. Nobody made a speech. It was just 22 people in a morning formation responding to the presence of someone who had earned something real and was finally letting them see it. Maya stood at the front of her formation and she looked at the people in front of her and she felt the weight on her chest, the actual physical weight of the medals on her actual uniform. And she did not feel crushed by it. She felt held up by it. There is a difference, and the difference is everything. And she had not understood that difference until right now, standing here in the cold October morning at Fort Bragg with her name on her chest and her record on display, and 22 people who knew what she was and were standing straight because of it. She said, "Good morning." 22 voices came back. "Good morning, Instructor Walker." The words landed in her chest in the place that had been empty for a long time, and they were not a cure. And they were not the end of anything hard. There would still be nights, still be the locked room and the wait, and the long arithmetic of survivor's guilt that didn't resolve in a morning formation on a Monday. She knew that. She was not foolish about it. But she was also not alone in it anymore and not running from it anymore. And those two things changed the geography of everything she was walking through. She had come to Fort Bragg to disappear. She had come here to find a place quiet enough and structured enough that the thing she was running from couldn't find enough oxygen to breathe. What she had found instead was 22 strangers who became something she didn't have a clean word for, and a colonel who read her file 3 times, and a woman named Sarah who had been gone for over a year, but whose voice still said stop calculating and do the right thing with the directness of someone who had never once in her life had the patience for unnecessary distance between a person and the truth. She had not saved Sarah. She could not save Sarah. That loss was real and permanent and hers, and she was going to carry it for the rest of her life in one form or another. And she had finally, on a Monday morning in October, in a formation at Fort Bragg, accepted that carrying it did not mean being broken by it. You carry what you carry. You stay in the position, you make the call, you move toward the problem instead of away from it, because moving toward is the only thing that has ever, in any situation she had ever been in, actually changed anything. She looked at her formation. She took a breath. She said, let's get to work. And for the first time in over a year, the words came out of her without the weight of someone pretending to be ready. They came out of her the way true things come out clean and certain and whole. Maya Walker was not healed. She was not finished grieving, not done with the hard nights, not past the moments when the locked room opened on its own in the small hours and everything came back at once. She was not the soldier she had been before Kandahar, because that soldier no longer existed and could not be rebuilt from the same materials. She was something else now, something that had been broken open and had not against significant odds stopped, something that had run and stopped running, something that had carried the weight of being alive when others weren't, and had finally on a Monday morning in the cold decided to carry it differently, not as penance, but as purpose. She was Instructor Walker. She was 28 years old. She was standing at the front of her formation with her record on her chest and her name spoken aloud by 22 people who knew exactly who she was. She was at last exactly where she was supposed to be.